even though the primary focus of today's gospel from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13 is on the parable of the sower, I'd like to draw your attention to the middle of the gospel, actually, where the Lord talks about why he speaks in parables to begin with. And so as you might recall, what he basically says is, these people see without seeing, they hear without hearing, oh, and by the way, they don't understand. And so the first thing to kind of notice right off the bat is that the Lord is making a really important distinction between seeing and hearing things from a worldly perspective as opposed to a spiritual one, such that his initial point, in a certain sense, is to kind of point out that in a world which is largely blind and deaf to spiritual things, you just got to be practical. You got to approach people where they're at, in a sense of using words and images and examples they can relate to and are sort of familiar with. And if you think about it, that's the whole point of the parables. Because what's a parable at the end of the day? A parable is a story which is built around an analogy drawn from everyday ordinary life to convey some sort of spiritual truth or spiritual reality. And so to use a really easy example, think about today's gospel, again from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 13. And so when faced again with people who are largely indifferent or perhaps even hostile to God or to the things of God, Jesus could easily have given them simply a lecture about the spiritual life, a lecture about the different ways in which we tend to inhibit the work of the Spirit, whether through our fears or attachments or our refusal or inability to guard our hearts. But instead what he does, he tells them the story. He tells them a really beautiful, poetic, provocative story about this sower who sows this seed, which for the most part fails to bear fruit because it's been sown on the path and the thorns and the rocky ground. Okay, so that's kind of the first point, a certain exaltation of the evangelical power of beauty and story. But the Lord is also making a secondary point, which is a little more subtle, and which requires a certain attentiveness to issues of language and grammar. And so if you go back to that original line, again, when the Lord talks about seeing and hearing, the key word or the key concept there is this notion of hearing. And you know that because it shows up 2 paragraphs later at a key part in the gospel. And so after having told the parable of the sower to the masses, Jesus goes behind closed doors and explains that particular parable to his disciples. And what he says is, hear then the parable of the sower. Now, the thing I want you to notice here is that the phrasing of that particular line is kind of unusual. Because if you think about it, what you might have expected to hear is something like, hear then what this parable actually means or signifies. But again, you don't hear that. What you hear instead is something really simple and economical. Hear then the parable of the sower. And the reason why that is because even though the gospel is originally written in Greek, it's trying to mirror the grammatical structure of Hebrew. And in Hebrew, even though it sounds kind of strange, there is no verbal equivalent of to mean or to signify. And so what you're left with is something which sounds more like an exhortation as opposed to an invitation. And so instead of hearing something like, let me explain to you what this parable is all about, what you hear is something which sounds like a command. Hear then the parable of the sower. Now, in the face of it, that might sound kind of strange, until you realize who it is that's actually speaking. Because, of course, the one who is speaking is Jesus Christ, the one living and true God. And so when he says here, you should realize that he's actually alluding to this thing called the Shema, which you find in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And the Shema, which literally means hear, incidentally, it is basically held to be the great embodiment of Israelite life and Israelite culture. And it basically goes like this. Hear then, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. Okay, so that's kind of a lot going on there. But if you put it all together, again, this emphasis on hearing, the fact that the thing is framed as an exhortation as opposed to an invitation, and the fact that there's a subtle allusion to the Shema, this exhortation to love God above all things, the Lord is giving us some insight as to how to actually approach the parables. So the whole idea here is that you must never approach the parables from a strictly intellectual approach, but rather you must always approach the parables with humility and docility and obedience. You must be prepared to let go of all your preconceived ideas as to how the world actually is, and instead surrender to God's perspective. What does God want me to see? What does he want me to hear? How does he want me to understand how life actually is, quite apart from how I conceive it to actually be? Okay, so to illustrate the point, let me give you a couple of examples, beginning with last weekend's gospel from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11. And so as you might recall from the previous podcast, I did a really extended exegesis on the first half of that first line from last weekend's gospel, again from the Gospel of Matthew chapter 11, which basically reads like this. Father, I thank you, Lord of heaven and earth. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on the second half of that first line from last weekend's gospel, which goes like this. Because you have hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants. Now, the thing I want to impress upon you is that reference to the wise and the intelligent doesn't necessarily mean what you might expect. So it's not like the Lord is saying, thank God you have hidden these things from the smart people. That's not what he means. And so if you break it down one piece at a time, the wise refer to people who are looking to achieve a certain mastery over a situation or issue. So again, the goal there is mastery. The intelligent, though, are looking for something else. Technically speaking, those who are intelligent are looking to achieve a certain synthesis with regards to a particular subject matter. And the thing I want you to notice here, at least on a preliminary basis, is that the aspiration to become wise and intelligent in temporal affairs is a very good and noble and praiseworthy thing. So if I'm trying to become a master carpenter, for example, or if I'm trying to achieve a certain synthesis with regards to being an IT specialist, that's good. It's good to want to achieve excellence with regards to your particular profession. The point still remains, though, that when it comes to matters of theology, you can't take the same approach. Because the moment I try to achieve a certain mastery or synthesis with regards to who God is or what he's all about, that goes against the very nature of revelation itself. Because at the end of the day, what is revelation? Revelation is not simply the product of my reason and observation. I can't think my way to revelation. I need to receive it, because revelation is simply the fruit of God's free, independent, autonomous decision to reveal to us the secrets of his inner life, to reveal to us the secrets of his heart. Okay, so that's kind of the first example, but I want to leave you with one final example to kind of drive the point home. And so arguably the most famous of Jesus' miracles is the multiplication of the loaves and the fish, which you find in all four Gospels, but most notably in the Gospel of John chapter 6. And so as you might recall, the story basically goes like this. There is people who leave their homes, their place of security, to follow Christ, to be with him, to abide in his presence, to listen to his word. And it's strongly implied that he's speaking for a long time, right? So they get kind of hungry. He asks them what they have. All they have are 5 loaves and 2 fish. He takes that, he multiplies that, feeds the 5,000. So that's basically the gist of it. That's the story of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish. But the thing I want to impress upon you is that there's actually another story which appears early on in the gospel, where Jesus is also asked to miraculously produce bread, but he refuses. And that, of course, is the temptation of Jesus in the desert. So you recall how Satan says to Jesus, turn these stones into bread, but again, Jesus refuses, which begs the question, why? Why does Jesus perform the miracle in John chapter 6, but then refuses the devil? And the answer is a little more complex than simply saying, well, it's because it's the devil. And so the reason why Jesus does the miracle in the Gospel of John chapter 6 is essentially threefold. And so first of all, the people have left everything to follow him. They have left everything, their places of security. They have left their homes to be with him, to abide in his presence, to listen to his word. That's the first thing. The second thing is they are prepared to give him everything and hold back nothing. Think about the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. They have left themselves in a state of vulnerability and helplessness, right? The third thing is that they trust him. They trust that he will ultimately provide. And you see, the reason I bring this up is because it gives us a really important working image for how we're supposed to approach the parables. Because you see, the whole idea is that we must never approach the parables like the wise and the intelligent. It's not a matter of being smart. Rather, we must always approach the parables with the mindset of a disciple. Am I prepared in my heart to leave everything behind? My old way of thinking, my old way of being, my old life, to receive that which God wants to give to me? Am I prepared to give him whatever he wants me to give? Am I prepared to give him everything and hold back nothing? And on top of that, do I trust him? Once I'm in a state of vulnerability, do I trust the Lord will provide what I need? Do I trust him with my life? If those different things are in place, the parables will blossom. They'll come alive before your very eyes. And you'll find yourself being fed with a sweetness like you've never known. Because at the end of the day, the Lord will be feeding you not with some random facts about the Catholic thing, but he'll be feeding you with the gift of his friendship, the gift of real intimacy with the one living and true God. And may God bless you all.